It did not smell like war. By 1943, the war had developed a very specific industrial scent. It was the acrid, biting stench of cordite, the heavy, cloying odor of high-octane aviation fuel, and the metallic tang of burnt aluminum and cooling steel. But here, in a dim, secret hangar outside Hamburg, the air smelled of something absurdly domestic. It smelled of a carpentry shop. It smelled of sawdust, varnish, and furniture. Under the harsh, clinical glare of the floodlights lay the corpse of a monster. It was a British de Havilland Mosquito, a bomber that had been forced down in a farmer's field, captured largely intact. To the men standing around it, men in white laboratory coats already stained with graphite and machine oil, it looked less like a weapon of mass destruction and more like a grand piano that had sprouted wings. It looked like something stolen from a cabinet maker rather than the sky. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, a senior materials analyst for the Reichs Luftfahrt Ministerium, the State Ministry of Aviation, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. He was a man of steel and science, a believer in the superiority of German metallurgy. He approached the fuselage, his face a mask of skepticism. He raised a knuckle and rapped it against the side of the aircraft. The sound was not the ping of metal. It was dull, resonant, and organic. It was the sound of knocking on a coffin. "It's plywood," Henkel murmured, the words feeling foreign and ridiculous in his mouth. A ripple of quiet, nervous laughter moved through the circle of technicians. One of them, a young man with grease under his fingernails, scoffed openly. "A wooden bomber? The English must have finally run out of aluminum. They are sending us heirlooms now, splinters and sawdust." They laughed because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. They had been told for months that this machine, this Mosquito, was the fastest aircraft the British possessed. They had been told it could outrun the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109 at full throttle. That claim seemed physically impossible. To the Luftwaffe engineers, wood belonged to the past. Wood was for gliders, for museums, for the era of the Red Baron. This was the age of jet propulsion, of pressurized cabins, of high tensile steel. But as the laughter died down, the work began. And with the work, the fear arrived. Outside, the relentless rain of northern Germany hissed against the corrugated iron roof. Inside, the team began to dissect the Mosquito with the precision of surgeons performing an autopsy on an alien life form. They looked for rivets. There were none. They looked for welded seams. There were none. What they found instead was a seamless, flowing sculpture. The fuselage was not a skeleton covered in skin. It was a single, unified shell. Henkel picked up a chisel. He found a seam where two layers of the fuselage met and tried to pry them apart to study the bonding agent. He applied pressure. The wood groaned, but the seam held. He pushed harder, leaning his weight into the tool. With a sharp crack, the steel blade of the chisel snapped. Henkel stared at the broken tool in his hand, then at the pristine glue line in the wood. A cold realization settled in his stomach. "This is not carpenter's glue," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Whatever they used, it is stronger than the wood itself." His assistant, trying to be helpful, suggested it might be a casein glue, a milk-based adhesive the Germans used for simple gliders. "Perhaps Bakelite?" he offered. Henkel shook his head slowly. "No, Bakelite is brittle. Look at this." He placed a fragment of the material under a heavy magnifying lens. "This adhesive, it's elastic. It absorbs stress. It's almost alive. Look at the fibers fused together like the grain of living tissue." As the hours wore on, the mood in the hangar shifted from mockery to a stunned, reverent silence. They began to realize the craftsmanship involved. This wasn't a crude improvisation. It was a masterpiece. The British had built an airplane the way a luthier builds a Stradivarius violin, layer by layer, tone by tone. Every curve of the fuselage was molded. Every contour served a purpose, reducing drag, channeling air, hiding immense structural strength beneath an elegant, polished surface. The more they touched the Mosquito, the less they mocked it. They began to sense an intelligence behind every joint, a ghost in the machine that was laughing at their steel tables and micrometers. By midnight, the floor was littered with sawdust, sketches, and empty coffee cups. Henkel sat back, rubbing his aching temples. The numbers on his clipboard didn't lie. This toy airplane had achieved speeds that their best metal bombers couldn't match. Somehow, wood had defeated steel. He looked at the pale curve of a wing root shining under the electric light. How? He whispered to the empty room. The irony gnawed at him. Germany, the land of precision engineering, the nation that prided itself on the purity of its industrial might, was being outpaced by a bomber glued together in furniture factories. Outside, the hum of night bombers echoed faintly over the city, the distant sound of an empire eroding. In that hangar, among the scent of glue and wet wood, the question was no longer whether the Mosquito worked. The question was what secret lay hidden within that glue that made it unstoppable. To understand the ghost in the hangar, we must travel back 4 years, to a time when the world was holding its breath. The year is 1938. The location is the British Air Ministry in London. The atmosphere is one of frantic preparation. Everyone knows war is coming. The generals and the bureaucrats are obsessed with armor, with turrets, with heavy defensive formations. They are preparing for a boxing match where the fighter who can take the hardest punch wins. Into this room walks a man named Geoffrey de Havilland. He is tall, composed, and quietly stubborn. He is an aristocrat of aviation, a man who designs planes with the eye of an artist. He unfolds his blueprints on a polished oak table. The officials look down, expecting a new heavy bomber, a flying fortress bristling with machine guns. Instead, de Havilland shows them a paradox. He proposes a bomber with no defensive guns, no turrets, no armor plating, and most absurd of all, he proposes to build it almost entirely out of wood. The silence in the room is deafening. The officials listen politely, waiting for the punchline. When none comes, they reject the idea outright. It is insulting. It is backward. Metal is the future, they tell him, tapping their fingers on the table. Wood belongs to the past. You might as well ask us to fight the Germans with bows and arrows. But de Havilland does not flinch. He sees something the bureaucrats cannot measure in their spreadsheets. He understands the arithmetic of survival. Speed, he tells them, is armor. If you are fast enough, you do not need to fight. You simply leave. Simplicity is survival. De Havilland had looked at the strategic reality of Britain and seen a terrifying truth. The nation was stretched thin. Aluminum, the lifeblood of modern aircraft, was being consumed faster than it could be mined and refined. The Spitfires, the Hurricanes, the new heavy Lancasters, they were all hungry for metal. Britain simply did not have enough. But de Havilland saw an untapped army. Britain's countryside was filled with small workshops, furniture makers, piano builders, cabinet craftsmen, men who had spent their lives shaping oak, ash, and birch. These were skilled hands that had no place in a metal war. They were currently unemployed or making utility furniture. What if, de Havilland thought, what if those hands could be turned toward building the deadliest machine on Earth? He envisioned a bomber streamlined to the silhouette of a bullet. Instead of rivets, which caused drag, he would use layers of birch plywood bonded with a core of Ecuadorian balsa wood. It was a sandwich of materials chosen not for glamour, but for geometry. Birch for tensile strength, balsa for lightness. The two joined by a glue stronger than any mechanical fastener. This technique, known as laminated monocoque construction, had been used in high-end furniture and racing planes, but never on a war machine of this scale. In de Havilland's mind, it was an equation of elegance. Every ounce saved by removing gun turrets was an ounce that could be spent on fuel and speed. When the war finally erupted in 1939, his idea seemed to evaporate. The Air Ministry ordered conventional bombers, lumbering giants of metal that could trade blows with the enemy. But war has a way of humbling certainty. By 1940, after the fall of France, Britain stood alone. The beaches of Dunkirk were empty, the equipment left behind. The Blitz began to pulverize London. The shortage of aluminum became critical. Suddenly, the impossible idea of a wooden bomber didn't look so foolish. It looked like salvation. Desperation opened the door that logic had closed. De Havilland was given the green light for one prototype, with a strict caveat. Do not interfere with Spitfire production. We won't need a single ounce of your metal, de Havilland promised. And so, in the autumn of 1940, under gray Hertfordshire skies, the first Mosquito began to take shape. It was built in a workshop that smelled of cedar and tea. Piano builders from London sanded the wings. Violin makers crafted the curved nose. It was an aircraft born of the forest, built by the hands of craftsmen, destined to burn down cities. The secret weapon of the Mosquito was not just the wood, it was the glue. The adhesive that bonded every seam came from furniture laboratories. It was a synthetic resin called phenol formaldehyde. To the layman, it was just sticky goop. To the chemist, it was a miracle. When applied between layers of wood and pressed under heat, this resin didn't just dry, it cured. It fused the wood fibers together on a molecular level. It created a composite material that was neither wood nor plastic, but something in between. Impervious to mold, resistant to water, and incredibly strong. It was quite literally born from craftsmanship and chemistry. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, painted a bright, training yellow so anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't shoot it down by mistake, rolled onto the runway at Hatfield. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, climbed into the cockpit. The aircraft sat low to the ground, looking fast even while standing still. The two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines roared to life, trembling like restrained animals. The crowd of officials watched with bated breath. They expected a struggle. They expected the wood to rattle, the heavy engines to tear the frame apart. Instead, the Mosquito leaped. It didn't climb, it rocketed. Within seconds, it was a yellow blur against the clouds. At altitude, de Havilland pushed the throttle. The needle climbed past 300 miles per hour, then 350, then 390. The Air Ministry observers, silent moments before, began to whisper in disbelief. It was faster than the Spitfire. It was faster than the German Messerschmitt. It was faster than any fighter aircraft then in service anywhere in the world. A wooden plane, built by piano makers, had just outflown the best machines of the Metal Age. That night, de Havilland Sr. walked alone through his workshop, past the half-finished frames glowing under the safety lamps. He ran his hand over the smooth, curing curve of a fuselage panel. It was warm to the touch, alive with promise. The world would never see war the same way again. A bomber built from furniture had just proven that imagination could outrun fear. When the Mosquito entered combat in 1941, it carried no guns, no gunners, and no illusions. Its survival depended entirely on mathematics. The pilots who were assigned to the first squadrons stared at the machine with quiet disbelief. These were men used to the heavy, comforting bulk of the Wellington or the Blenheim bombers. They were used to having a rear gunner to watch their back. They were used to armor plating. Now they were asked to climb into a cockpit barely large enough for two men, pilot and navigator, seated shoulder to shoulder. There was no one behind them. There was no steel floor beneath them. Just plywood and air. The flight manual was brutally simple. If intercepted, do not fight. Run. Keep the throttle wide open and trust in the Merlin engines. The baptism of fire came on September 20th, 1941. A formation of Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron launched a daylight raid on Oslo, Norway. The target was the Gestapo headquarters. This was a statement. Until now, bombing raids were mostly conducted under the cover of darkness. To fly in daylight was considered suicide. The Mosquitoes dropped to 50 feet above the North Sea. They flew so low that the spray from the waves coated their windscreens. They sliced through the mist like sharks. German radar stations were looking for high-altitude bomber formations. They never saw the wooden ghosts skimming the waves. By the time the air raid sirens wailed in Oslo, the bombs were already falling. German fighter pilots scrambled from nearby airfields, sprinting to their Messerschmitts. But as they climbed to intercept, they realized the geometry of the battle had changed. They couldn't close the gap. They pushed their engines to the breaking point, but the Mosquitoes simply pulled away, vanishing into the thin air. Witnesses on the ground reported a ghostly roar, followed by silence. It was as if the bombers had never been there. Every aircraft returned to base unscathed. By early 1943, the crews began to understand the rhythm of the machine. They fell in love with it. They found that the wood offered a strange protection. When a steel bomber was hit by flak, the metal shattered, creating deadly shrapnel inside the cockpit. But when a shell passed through the Mosquito, it punched a clean hole through the wood. The plywood absorbed the vibration. It didn't tear. The absence of aluminum meant fewer sparks and less fuel vapor ignition. Pilots described it as flying a living thing, flexible, forgiving, responsive. One crew, returning from a low-level raid over Cologne, recounted how tracer fire chased them through the Rhine Valley. "The shells seemed to float beside us," the pilot said, "and then fall away. It was as if the air itself was protecting us." The legend of the Wooden Wonder began to spread, but across the Channel, the Germans had a different name for it. They called it Die Pest, the plague, or das Holzernwunder, with a sneer that hid their fear. To the Luftwaffe, the Mosquito was not just an enemy aircraft. It was a ghost that haunted their radar screens. When the Mosquito entered combat in 1941, it carried no guns, no gunners, and no illusions. Its survival depended entirely on mathematics. The pilots who were assigned to the first squadrons stared at the machine with quiet disbelief. These were men used to the heavy, comforting bulk of the Wellington or the Blenheim bombers. They were used to having a rear gunner to watch their back. They were used to armor plating. Now they were asked to climb into a cockpit barely large enough for two men, pilot and navigator, seated shoulder to shoulder. There was no one behind them. There was no steel floor beneath them, just plywood and air. The flight manual was brutally simple. If intercepted, do not fight. Run. Keep the throttle wide open and trust in the Merlin engines. The baptism of fire came on September 20th, 1941. A formation of Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron launched a daylight raid on Oslo, Norway. The target was the Gestapo headquarters. This was a statement. Until now, bombing raids were mostly conducted under the cover of darkness. To fly in daylight was considered suicide. The Mosquitoes dropped to 50 feet above the North Sea. They flew so low that the spray from the waves coated their windscreens. They sliced through the mist like sharks. German radar stations were looking for high-altitude bomber formations. They never saw the wooden ghosts skimming the waves. By the time the air raid sirens wailed in Oslo, the bombs were already falling. German fighter pilots scrambled from nearby airfields, sprinting to their Messerschmitts. But as they climbed to intercept, they realized the geometry of the battle had changed. They couldn't close the gap. They pushed their engines to the breaking point, but the Mosquitoes simply pulled away, vanishing into the thin air. Witnesses on the ground reported a ghostly roar, followed by silence. It was as if the bombers had never been there. Every aircraft returned to base unscathed. By early 1943, the crews began to understand the rhythm of the machine. They fell in love with it. They found that the wood offered a strange protection. When a steel bomber was hit by flak, the metal shattered, creating deadly shrapnel inside the cockpit. But when a shell passed through the Mosquito, it punched a clean hole through the wood. The plywood absorbed the vibration. It didn't tear. The absence of aluminum meant fewer sparks and less fuel vapor ignition. Pilots described it as flying a living thing, flexible, forgiving, responsive. One crew, returning from a low-level raid over Cologne, recounted how tracer fire chased them through the Rhine Valley. "The shells seemed to float beside us," the pilot said, "and then fall away. It was as if the air itself was protecting us." The legend of the wooden wonder began to spread, but across the channel, the Germans had a different name for it. They called it Die Pest, the plague, or das Holzenwunder, with a sneer that hid their fear. To the Luftwaffe, the Mosquito was not just an enemy aircraft. It was a ghost that haunted their radar screens. If there was one man who hated the Mosquito more than any other, it was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, a man of immense ego who had promised Hitler that enemy aircraft would never fly swiftly over the Reich. The Mosquito made a liar out of him on a weekly basis. The ultimate humiliation came in January 1943. It was the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power. A massive parade and broadcast were scheduled in Berlin. Göring was set to give a speech that would be broadcast across the entire German Empire. He was to speak of invincibility, of the iron sky of Germany. The Royal Air Force decided to RSVP to the party. They sent a small flight of Mosquitoes to Berlin. The timing was calculated with sadistic precision. Just as Göring stepped to the microphone, just as he began to speak of the glory of the Luftwaffe, the air raid sirens began to scream. The broadcast was cut. The windows of the Air Ministry rattled with the shock waves of 500-pound bombs exploding nearby. The Mosquitoes had flown all the way to the capital, in broad daylight, delivered their message, and turned for home before a single German fighter could catch them. Göring was apoplectic. The unthinkable had happened. Wooden bombers had struck the heart of the Third Reich and escaped without loss. In a private rage that was later leaked by his staff, he shouted, "I turn green with envy when I see the British flying about in their scrapwood planes. They have the geniuses, and we have the nincompoops. After the war, I shall buy a British radio set. Then at least I shall own something that has always worked." It was a funny quote, but the reality was grim. The Mosquito was breaking the morale of the German High Command. It proved that the Third Reich did not control the sky. New orders were issued to Luftwaffe squadrons stationed in occupied Europe. They were grim admissions of defeat. If a Mosquito is sighted, do not pursue unless conditions are perfect. Why? Because chasing a Mosquito was a trap. German pilots would push their engines into the red zone, trying to catch the wooden bomber. They would burn up all their fuel in a futile chase, leaving them vulnerable to other fighters or forcing them to crash land. In dives, the Mosquito accelerated beyond structural safety limits for German planes. The Mosquito killed enemy planes simply by existing. Back in the secret hangar in Germany, Dr. Hankel and his team were given an order that defied logic. "Build us a Mosquito," the ministry commanded. "If the British can make a wooden wonder, German science can make a better one." The project was given the name Mosquito, meant to mock the rival, but later designated the Focke-Wulf TA-154. It was meant to be the British killer. On paper, it looked perfect. It had twin engines, it had a wooden airframe, it had the same aggressive silhouette. But as Hankel knew, you cannot reverse engineer a soul. The tragedy of the German Mosquito was a tragedy of chemistry. The British had access to Ecuadorian balsa wood and Canadian birch. Germany was blockaded. They had only heavy beech and pine. A single wing section that weighed 280 kilograms in the Mosquito ballooned to 410 kilograms in the German mock-up. But the real killer was the glue. The British had their special phenolic resin. Germany's chemical industry was being bombed into oblivion. They could not produce the synthetic resin in the quantities needed. So the Germans compromised. They used a distinct, acidic, cold glue substitute mixed with formalin to slow degradation. Hankel warned them. "This glue," he wrote in his reports, "contains acid. It will eat into the wood over time. It is sensitive to moisture. His warnings were ignored. The propaganda machine needed a victory. Production orders were issued to furniture factories in Dresden and Kassel. But German workers faced raw material shortages, constant air raids, and a lack of trained labor. The Mosquito had been born in creativity. The German copy was born in desperation. The result was a disaster. During the maiden flights, the German Mosquito looked impressive. But as soon as the weather turned, the glue began to fail. Moisture seeped into the joints. The acid in the adhesive began to rot the wood from the inside out. It was a flaw every engineer recognized, but none dared report. In June 1944, the first production models fell apart in mid-air. Wings delaminated. Fuselages cracked open like overripe fruit. The pilots didn't stand a chance. The project was quietly canceled. The unfinished airframes were left to rot in the rain. It was a perfect metaphor for the war itself. The British Mosquito was born of creativity and confidence. The German copy was born of desperation and dogma. Dr. Hankel watched the failure from his office. In his private journal, he wrote a single, damning sentence: "We are fighting physics with paperwork." By 1944, the Mosquito had evolved. It was no longer just a nuisance. It was the conductor of the orchestra of destruction. The RAF developed a new role for the wooden bomber, the Pathfinder. Every night, before the massive fleets of heavy Lancaster bombers arrived to flatten a German industrial city, the Mosquitoes would go in first. They were the tip of the spear. Using advanced navigation technology, they would fly through the darkness, pinpoint the target factories, and drop bright red and green flares. They were marking the X on the map. The heavy bombers, thousands of feet above, simply had to drop their loads on the colored fires the Mosquitoes had lit. The accuracy of British bombing skyrocketed. The Mosquitoes were the eyes of the night. But they were also the hunters. Mosquito night fighters, equipped with radar in their noses, prowled the darkness looking for German bombers. They were sleek, black-painted sharks. German crews called them Drahtverhau, a slang term implying a difficult, thorny entanglement. If you saw the flame-dampened exhaust of a Mosquito behind you, you were already dead. The statistics of the war tell the story in cold, hard numbers. The average loss rate for heavy metal bombers like the Lancaster or the B-17 hovered around 5% to 7% per mission. That meant, statistically, a crew member was unlikely to survive a full tour of duty. For the Mosquito, the loss rate was less than 1%. One aircraft lost for every 200 missions. It was the safest combat aircraft of the war. Pilots joked grimly that flying a Mosquito over Berlin was safer than walking across Piccadilly Circus in the blackout. But behind the humor lay a profound truth. Speed was the only armor that mattered. The German High Command responded with desperation, disguised as strategy. New radar networks were built to track fast targets, and propaganda officers claimed that the Mosquito was overrated. But the numbers could not be hidden. In 1944 alone, Mosquito bombers dropped over 1,900 tons of explosives, with fewer than 200 aircraft lost. By the final winter of the war, the Mosquito's very name could silence a room in Germany's command centers. Reports of sightings came with a sigh rather than an alarm. Everyone knew that by the time the warning arrived, the damage was already done. The Luftwaffe still flew, but its morale was hollowed out. For them, the Mosquito was not an aircraft. It was inevitability, precision, and humiliation shaped into wings. When the war ended in 1945, the Mosquito had flown more than 80,000 combat sorties. It had dropped bombs, taken photographs, hunted submarines, and destroyed trains. It had done everything asked of it, and it had done it with an elegance that defied the ugliness of the conflict. In the chaos of the post-war months, Allied inspection teams invited captured German engineers to tour the de Havilland plant at Hatfield. Among them was Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel. He walked into the assembly hall. He smelled the familiar scent of resin and sawdust, the smell that had haunted him in that hangar in Hamburg 2 years prior. He watched men in simple overalls polishing the curved fuselage halves before they were bonded together. He saw the violin makers. He saw the piano tuners. He saw the furniture craftsmen. Hunkel turned to his British escort, a young engineer barely out of university, and asked, "How many great scientists designed this process?" The Briton smiled. "Not many scientists, doctor, but thousands of craftsmen." That sentence stayed with Hunkel for the rest of his life. In his final report to the Allies, he wrote that the Mosquito's secret was not just chemistry or aerodynamics. It was culture. It was the willingness to let the craftsman and the engineer share the same space. Where Germany had been ruled by rigid hierarchy and fear of failure, the British had allowed improvisation. A violin maker could teach an engineer about resonance. A chemist could learn from a furniture worker. Out of that collision of worlds had come something that no pure theory could have predicted. The legacy of the Mosquito did not end with the war. In the late 1940s and 50s, engineers began to experiment with new materials. They looked at the plywood sandwich of the Mosquito and thought, what if we used glass fibers instead of wood? What if we used carbon? The laminated monocoque construction of the Mosquito is the direct ancestor of every modern composite aircraft. When you step onto a Boeing 787 Dreamliner today, or look at the carbon fiber hull of a Formula One car, you are looking at the great-grandchildren of the wooden wonder. Dr. Henkel's notes were filed away in archives, gathering dust, but the lesson remains vibrant. Time transformed the Mosquito from a weapon into a teacher. It taught the world that progress does not always come from abundance. Sometimes it comes from scarcity. Sometimes it comes from looking at a pile of wood and seeing a way to fly. Today, if you visit a museum and walk past a surviving Mosquito, take a moment to look closely. The surface still gleams like varnished oak. You can almost smell the resin. It is a silent testament to the moment when imagination outran fear. The men who built it are gone now, their names scattered across archives and airfields. Yet their idea remains alive. Every time a modern airliner takes off with composite wings or a spacecraft launches wrapped in resin and fiber, they prove that technology is not born from comfort, but from courage. The courage to build what everyone else calls impossible. And somewhere in the grain of that wood, the ghost of the impossible still laughs at the limitations of steel. Dr. Henkel's notes were filed away in archives, gathering dust, but the lesson remains vibrant. Time transformed the Mosquito from a weapon into a teacher. It taught the world that progress does not always come from abundance. Sometimes it comes from scarcity. Sometimes it comes from looking at a pile of wood and seeing a way to fly. Today, if you visit a museum and walk past a surviving Mosquito, take a moment to look closely. The surface still gleams like varnished oak. You can almost smell the resin. It is a silent testament to the moment when imagination outran fear. The men who built it are gone now, their names scattered across archives and airfields. Yet their idea remains alive. Every time a modern airliner takes off with composite wings or a spacecraft launches wrapped in resin and fiber, they prove that technology is not born from comfort, but from courage. The courage to build what everyone else calls impossible. And somewhere in the grain of that wood, the ghost of the impossible still laughs at the limitations of steel.